Hola, bona tarda. Tornem a començar les xerrades i ara tindrem a l'Andy Swash que ens explicarà com han elaborat aquesta guia, i permeteu-me que és una guia, com podeu veure aquí, dels ocells d'Europa, i només us vull dir un parell de dades, perquè és una guia en la que ara ell ens ho explicarà, sobretot ens explicarà el procés de l'elaboració, com han triat les fotografies, les espècies, etc. Però a part de que el temps que ha trigat, ell és un personatge, ell és un gran ornitòleg reconegut, naturalista, escriptor, i jo més volia no enrotllar-me gaire, però coses que m'han sorprès, que en aquesta guia cobreix 928 espècies d'ocells de l'àmbit europeu, amb tots els plomatges, etc. I ell ha tingut que navegar amb un mar de fotografies, de 4.700 fotografies, en les quals ha hagut d'haver-hi la tria per fer aquesta obra, d'acord? I sense més enrotllar-me, li donaré la paraula amb ell. Gràcies, thank you very much. You're welcome.
Hola, buenas tardes. Muchas gracias. I have to speak English, I'm afraid, because my Spanish, as you will tell, is very, very poor. So apologies for that. I'm going to give you a talk this afternoon about the making of a book, which may sound pretty boring. I hope it isn't boring, because it's an interesting, hopefully, introduction to what makes a field guide. So, Europe's Birds is a book that was published 2 years ago in English and is now available in Spanish. And when I was discussing what I might usefully discuss today and talk about today with Francesc, he said, well, just talk about the backstory. What is actually behind a book? What is involved in making a book such as Europe's Birds? The next question he asked was, how long did it take? The answer to which was about 60 years. And that's because that's basically been my life in trying to produce this book. You'll see that this is in English, and there's also now a Spanish edition of the book. But I'll talk about that a little bit as I go through the presentation. So this is about 60 years ago. This is me with my great-grandfather. He at this time was about 90, and it was him when I was 2 really who inspired me to take an interest in birds. And I think that was the key thing for me, was making a start, becoming interested in birds at a very, very early age. And it was a robin that flew up to a feeder next to the window outside his room that caught my eye, and that was really the start for me of having a lifetime spent with a passion for birds and working on birds and trying to do as much as I possibly could for bird conservation around the world. Apparently it didn't take me very long before I started teaching other people how to identify birds. This is me at the age of about 5 apparently, and my little brother Mike, I had to teach when he was 3 how to identify these mute swans. So I got started quite early, and so this is the sort of start of an interest in birds, which was, I suppose, really then enhanced by my grandparents giving me a copy of this little pocket book called The Observer's Book of Birds. This is obviously in English, and it's a tiny little book which contains some fantastic little illustrations. The illustrations and the pages in this book look basically like this. So if you wanted to identify certain species, they were pretty straightforward. So for example, every time I saw a new bird, this is even at the age of about 5, I used a little scribbly line underneath the name to record what I'd seen. But I was often slightly concerned because that I was looking at birds and I didn't really know what they were. This one, though, was, I think, quite easy for me, because you could see the goldfinch on the left. So when a goldfinch did fly onto a branch outside our room, outside the kitchen window. I could readily identify this bird simply by looking at certain features that the book had told me to look for, which was it's got a red face, it's got some white on the head and black on the head, and some gold in the wing. So I could be pretty confident that this was a goldfinch. I was looking at these two birds and wondering whether you could say this was a male and this was a female, and then gave up because I had no idea what I was looking for. So these are European goldfinches, and you'll notice I put in brackets for each of these photographs I put up. I put the English name and the scientific name, but also just to make a point that the European goldfinch is now what we call it. At the time I was a lad, a young boy, goldfinches were just called goldfinches. There was no sort of distinction between goldfinch and any other type of goldfinch. In this little pocket guide, the Observer's Book of Birds, there were lots of other birds, and I thought, I must go and see those at some point. And I was very lucky when I was a little bit older, in my sort of 10s, 11 sort of time, to be on holiday up in the Highlands of Scotland and managed to see a golden plover. And I was able to confidently identify this bird because it looked exactly like the picture in the book. And here was not actually this bird, but a bird that looked very like this in the Highlands of Scotland, wandering around with its lovely black belly. So I was pretty confident then I could identify a golden plover, which we now know, of course, is one of 3 types of golden plover. I didn't know this at the time, because the book just told me it was a golden plover. So this is European golden plover, and as you'll see later on, I won't go into plover identification, but there are 3 types of golden plover in the world, all of which could potentially be very readily misidentified or confused. At about the age of 10 or 11, I suppose, my parents decided that I really did like birds so much that I needed to have one on my shoulder. So at any opportunity of seeing a bird, the bird would appear on my shoulder and I would be photographed with it with my lovely brother and sister. But it was about 1954 that this was not my age, by the way, 1954 that this book, the Field Guide to the Birds of Britain and Europe, was published. And this was a present to me in about 1974, in my late teens, mid to late teens, which really got me going and really got me fired up to try to identify birds. And it started to make me think about, if I was doing a book on birds, I don't know why I was thinking about it at this early age, but if I was ever producing a book on birds, the sort of information I would really like is A, B and C, and hopefully this afternoon I will be able to give you an indication of the sort of things I was looking for. So this book that I've just shown you had a slightly difficult, for me as a user, difficult layout, in as much as it's a fantastic book with lots of great information, but some of the information, like the text, is on one page, and then the illustrations are on another page. So to actually look at the 2 components together, what does the bird look like, and then reading about it, you had to switch between pages. So this is just a typical page from this book, and then there was also the plates of birds either in flight or perched. Many of them were in black and white, some of them were in colour, but it was quite cleverly done because the birds that you really could identify readily on pattern rather than on specific colours were all together. So I got to spend my lovely evenings looking at these plates, thinking, I'd love to see one of these birds, I'd love to see one of these birds, and getting very excited about the opportunity to do so. What I didn't know at the time was that these are the American names of European birds. So you have things like the old squaw here, and lots of other birds which really you don't get in Europe anywhere. I mean, at the time that this book was written, there are a number of species here that had never been recorded in Europe, so it's a slightly confusing situation for a young person coming into the world of bird watching. So anyway, in my late teens, I was still getting pretty keen on birds. I was very carefully and cleverly given, yeah, that is me, honestly. I was given a telescope when I was fairly young and couldn't afford a tripod, so I had to sort of find a way of protecting myself and raising the telescope, I should say, so I could actually see. It was extremely painful, I have to say. So this is a big call out for tripods. They really are great if you can get them. So anyway, it's in my late teens that I then went off to university, and this is a classic photograph of a university outing in the UK back in the late 70s. Everybody lined up here looking to see what was flying past using a telescope on a tripod, which was really great. The amazing thing, when I was looking at this photo, and I don't normally talk about my sort of background, but every person on that photograph who went to the same university is now professionally involved in bird conservation. It's unbelievable that that number of people could be so enthralled to take an interest in bird conservation in their 18, 19, sort of 20 sort of year age period. Anyway, so this is us looking at out to sea in the great hope of seeing something useful, and flying past was a fantastic sight. This is one winter's day in Scotland with these birds flying past. Now I thought, I know what these are because I've seen it in my book. So I grabbed my book and showed this to my fellow students and thought, yes, well, I have got the book now. I can see the pattern on this book, on these birds, and you compare that with the book, and there you are. You can see that this is the old squaw. So when I told my friends that these were old squaws flying past, they thought I was completely mad, because of course nobody knew at the time. Nobody knew these birds as old squaws. They used the proper new name, which is long-tailed duck. So this is a photograph of some long-tailed ducks flying past. So that was an interesting entree to what do we call the birds and which names do we use. It was in 1979 that this book was published, which was a fantastic field guide for me in my late years at university, which was basically the only way I could really confidently identify birds. So this was a great page of yellow wagtails. They're not all yellow. Yellow wagtails on the left and white or pied wagtails on the right. And so when one dropped in front of me, I could confidently say, yes, this is a yellow wagtail. But this book was good enough to be able to tell me which type of yellow wagtail, because there, of course, are a whole range of subspecies of yellow wagtail. So I got the book out, compared the bird I was seeing with the plate in the book, and was a pretty confident call that this was in fact the bird top right on this photograph, which is the yellow wagtail, the British yellow wagtail, with this particular subspecific name, flavissima. So it worked, and the thing to me that was really fantastic about this book is that the illustrations were so accurate. I was pretty confident that I could identify pretty much anything that would crop up. Here's another yellow wagtail, but this one has got a sort of bluey head and a bit of white above the eye and so on. And here again, I put the page of the book up, comparing this particular bird with the plate in the book. I then came to the conclusion, yes, it must be this one here. This is the blue-headed wagtail, on the basis that it had a bluish head. And there are a few species on this plate that had a blue head. And then there were some subtle comments about looking at the extent of the white over the eye and looking at the amount of yellow and white on the throat. So doing that and comparing it with the plate in the book, yeah, I was pretty confident that this was a blue-headed wagtail. So there, I put in my book and duly made a note that we had seen this lovely bird. But the other things in this book that slightly worried me were the ones that looked very similar. So there was this plate of Locustella warblers. They all, to me, on the face of it, from this plate, looked pretty similar. So it spent a bit of time trying to work out how you would separate the species. And the text in this book was very, very good. It actually pointed out the details that you needed to look for to be able to identify it. So when a Locustello warbler popped up in front of me one day, I could actually look at the detail on this bird and say, okay, I can look at this and I can compare it with the field guide, and I can see that it's got some streaking on the back and it's got certain streaking on the breast and so on. And you could then be pretty confident on the basis of the text and the details that you could see in the photograph or through your binoculars or telescope that it was in fact a common grasshopper warbler. In those days they were just called grasshopper warblers, but of course there's now more than, in English anyway, more than one species of grasshopper warbler. So that got me going with that, but it was in 1979 that the first photographic guide that I'm aware of that was supposedly potentially useful in the field was published, and this is Richards' book on British birds, a field guide. This is a little bit Anglo-centric, I'm afraid. I'm not exactly sure what the situation with bird books in the rest of Europe, but certainly in the context of a British bird watcher, one upcoming British bird watcher, this is what we had to go at. This book was, I think the word woeful was used. When I picked it up I thought, I can't use this book. And I think this is the reason why many people have often thought photographic guides don't work. They just can't work, because in an illustrated guide you can paint exactly what you see and you can compare like with like. This book, which shows two species of black bird, a black bird on the right here and a ring ouzel up here, which I don't know whether it's got a crest or not because the top of the head is chopped off in the book. That sort of problem when it comes to producing a book without showing the whole bird is very difficult to tell. I couldn't also tell whether the black bird was bigger than a ring ouzel or smaller or anything. And there's also a picture here, an illustration added, so it was a combination of field guide that had a combination of photographs and illustrations. And it was in the following year that this rather larger format book was produced in English, Birds of Britain and Europe, which really was the first attempt to try to collate information with photographs for the use not in the field. It was far too big to use in the field, but it had some very interesting material that was new to me. So it had maps which showed the distribution of the species during the breeding season and in the winter. It had a sort of outline profile which I thought was really helpful to show the silhouette in flight, but I couldn't tell without reading the detail whether the merlin, which is this species here, is actually bigger. Well, it looks much, much bigger than a peregrine, but we all know, of course, if we're into birding, that the peregrine is much bigger than a merlin. So it started to throw up issues that comparing like with a photograph in a box just was really, really difficult to do. So that was an interesting experience, but it did sort of get me thinking about the fact that when I was looking at birds in my garden, and this is a field fair, it was possible to identify them from most of the books that I had, but I was also starting to think, well, okay, I've actually got some photographs here that I could put in these books, and why don't we start to think about collating material that could potentially be useful for putting in our own book at some point in the future. I sort of had a sort of wish to try to do my own field guide at some point, even in those early days. So this is a barn owl flying by, just to show the sort of photographs that might be useful in a field guide, because you could then point out the key features without having to get some very keen artist to draw barn owls and then draw another bird in a similar fashion. So this was just to make the point that we had lots of photographs, and friends of mine had lots of photographs of birds which potentially could be useful for publication. This is a peregrine falcon, but we started to notice that some of the peregrine falcons we were seeing were different from others. So this is a nice grey one, there were also some brown ones, and there were some ones with barred breasts, and it was actually quite difficult at times to be certain that your peregrine really was a peregrine. So what I'm trying to say here is there's lots of plumages of each species that potentially could confuse issues. And the thing that did really get me very confused at one stage was, having seen my golden plover very early on, as I showed you at the beginning of the presentation, when I saw this flock of what actually are golden plovers flying around, there is no way I could have told you what this species was from the books I had, because none of them said they occur in big flocks swirling around like this in the winter, and they didn't really highlight the fact that in the winter they don't have a black belly. They just say it has whitish on the underparts. So it to me looked like a completely different bird, which I had some difficulty in at the time in identifying. So then I just started to look at birds more closely, because that flock of golden plovers was interesting in as much as I didn't know what they were, but I was pretty confident that I knew what these were. These are, of course, are avocets, a flock of avocets flying around. But when I started to look at these flocks, you realise that they're not alone. There's other things amongst these flocks that you could potentially overlook. So these are pied avocets, but look here, there's one here with a black head. After a bit of fiddling around, I managed to realise, of course, this was a gull, but that one had a black head. This one here looks pretty similar, but it hasn't got a black head. And this one over here looks pretty similar again, but it's got some brown on the wings and it's got some black on the tail. The other two have got completely white tails. So what are they? And again, it was at the time a bit of a struggle to identify these birds, and in fact they're all the same species, but of different ages and different plumages. So you start to realise that bird watching isn't just saying, oh, that's that because it's black and white, a pied avocet, but other things, particularly birds like gulls, can be extremely confusing because they have different plumages. So I guess what I'm getting at here is that it's worth looking at everything and assuming they're not all the same. So this is a flock of godwits, I thought, initially. And you'll see these are black-tailed godwits, most of them, but there's some other birds you may notice amongst this flock which are not the same. So there's one here, which is got a slightly different pattern. It's got a shorter bill, it's smaller. This one looks as similar to the one over there. So there's basically three different birds of the same species. One's got some black, you can perhaps just see here on the breast. This one hasn't. So it's confusing. It's always very confusing, particularly with birds like waders. So this is these are actually ruff, or ruffs. There's three different birds amongst these godwits. So picking out the different species amongst another flock is actually quite an interesting bit of fun, and it's trying to work out and explain how you know what they are, which is quite a challenge. So those people who like to go sea watching, this is obviously a seascape in a very heavy wind, or strong wind, heavy sea, of Manx shearwaters flying by. So you probably will notice that there are a few details. This one here has got some white on the underparts, and this one you can see is very dark on the upper side, and they're all Manx shearwaters. Or are they? Well, there's one over here which is a little bit different, but that's obviously not a Manx shearwater because it's white. And this is actually obviously a completely different bird. It's a fulmar. But there are other potential confusion species amongst the Manx shearwaters that you could see. So it's worth looking at every bird. So my message is always look at every bird as closely as you can and try and collate as much information in your mind as to help you identify it. But I think for me the big breakthrough was when this book, The Birds of Europe, by Lars Johnson, was published in 1992, which was absolutely fantastic illustrations. To my mind, it actually captured the essence of the bird and was a really, really helpful comparison of all the species. So, you know, here we have a whole bunch of very similar on the face of it looking wheat ears. In fact, there's a whole bunch of species that look like this that are so difficult to identify unless you look very closely at certain details like the tail pattern. So this was the first time I think anyone had really tried to explain what to look for when you look at these wheat ears. So here's a wheat ear sitting on a rock. Out of context, what do you look for? So you pick out the book, and this was the only opportunity I then had to really get into these potentially quite difficult birds. So I concluded ultimately that it was this one here, which is a northern wheat ear, and you could start to see the details and start to focus on information that would allow you to identify it with confidence. Yeah, that's still me. Fortunately, having gone through my university time, I then spent some time working as an environmental advisor to the UK government. It was a proper job, which was actually quite helpful because it allowed me to live as much as anything else. But it did teach me a lot more than just making a living. And the key thing was it actually taught me to write. And I was during this time was drafting a whole range of documents for government ministers, which had to be written in very plain language, because most government ministers don't understand very much. So you have to put it really plain, very, very plain language, and it does then allow you to hone your skills at putting over something in a simple way. So it was very useful for me. I also learnt to sing while I was doing this. Not true. No, this is not me trying to emulate Pavarotti, but I was actually giving lots of speeches around the place. But it also gave me an opportunity to do what I really enjoyed, which was being out in the field, looking at wildlife. I'm very, very interested in dragonflies as much as birds. So it gave me a chance to go and look at these things without having to worry about paying the mortgage and those sort of things quite so much. But it also gave me an opportunity to travel. And this was actually, I think now, thinking back, the reason that I really got into the field guide. It may seem a bit bizarre, but this is Galapagos, and I was fortunate to be able to go on a holiday to Galapagos back in the mid-1990s. And it was here that I took the only book available, which was this book called The Birds of Galapagos Islands. And here is the plate of the 13 species of Galapagos finch, or Darwin's finch, that we may have seen in those days. So, here we are. The first of the finches that we came across was this very large looking chunky headed finch, and I was looking at the plate here and I thought, what is this? When you compare this with the plate in the book, would you be able to put a name to this bird? Well, I sort of came to the conclusion that it was closest to this. It had a big bill, but it had this streaky breast, and the bill wasn't quite the same colour. It was obviously like that, but it wasn't quite like that. Then I started looking at the detail in the book, and you realise that it says this is a male in breeding plumage, this is a male in non-breeding plumage, but there's no photograph, no illustration of a female. So you had no idea on the face of it what it was. But that's what it was, by almost a process of elimination, that it had to be a female large ground finch. I just put a couple more similar examples up because I think it actually does make the point that unless it's very accurately illustrated in the book, you may as well not bother. So this is another question mark bird that was on the Galapagos, and ultimately concluded that it was one of these small tree finches. And in fact that's what it is, but it does look quite different from the picture here on the screen, where this has got it seems, a white breast. They don't have white breasts, they have a sort of buffy breast. Another one here which is basically all black, and it's got a pointy bill. And what is this? Well, okay, it's closest probably to the one over here, but the bill is all black, which is great. But this doesn't tell you, this particular book, that this is an adult non-breeding, and this is the one on the actual photograph is an adult breeding male, breeding plumage. So it just showed me that there was a real problem in trying to identify some of these birds. I'll just give you a couple more examples of one that actually did seem to be quite easy on the face of it, and this was a medium ground finch. And one more example is this one, which was completely baffling because I couldn't make it into anything from this book at all. I had no idea what this was, and I even then had to put a big question mark in the book. I have no clue what this is. Subsequently, I've been to Galapagos a number of times, and I've simply since then done quite a lot of research on these finches, and this one is in fact a female one of those, but that's not illustrated in the book. So if you were in Galapagos, you could not identify every bird you saw. So I came back from Galapagos, and one of my best friends, Rob Still, who's a graphic designer and a birder, said, you've got the photographs, I can design the book, just do it, as you do. So we then started out to produce a book called The Birds, Mammals and Reptiles of Galapagos, and at the same time set up a little company called Wild Guides. This was in year 2000, and we produced this book which was entirely based on photos, and this was the first time anybody tried to produce a photographic montaged field guide for all species that you're likely to see. And the plates we came up with were like this. So these were all taken on slides, no digital photography in these days. It was all taken on slides, which then had to be scanned and then managed and manipulated in Photoshop to create these montage plates that allowed you to actually do direct comparisons of the species concerned. So that was just just a simple job, we thought. No, it took about 6 years of non-stop work to try to collate the material to make this book work, and including in it some quite, we thought, novel ideas. The key thing with these birds is to identify them by the shape of the bill. So we thought, oh well, let's just do a 2-scale suite of images with the bills of each of the species shown for comparison. So you don't actually need anything more. Almost, you could go to Galapagos with that page and be confident about identifying every finch. That actually was quite an interesting way of going about things. But then we had some other ideas that we would build the entire book with photographs, and we did some other sort of manipulative plates where we were trying to merge slides so that we could create montage plates like this, which were all the phalaropes together. And we were very delighted the following year to win this Technical Innovation in Publishing Award in the States, which was basically the start of a long journey of producing books of this ilk for many types of plant and animal. So this is the Wild Guides start, and then since then we've produced lots of books in different series. I won't bore you with what they are, but lots of books came out over the following 10 years or so, and these included different types of plants and animals like butterflies, where we again tried to approach this by using photographs, manipulating them in terms of size so that they were all comparative, and putting in all the details you might possibly want, males and females and different subspecies and so on. So that worked really well for butterflies. In Britain we don't have that many species, so it was fairly straightforward. And the same situation with dragonflies that, as I mentioned, I was very keen on, where you could again manipulate the images to create these montage plates with the different subspecies shown or different forms shown, and all the different types of dragonflies covered in one book. As well as perched, we were also looking for in this case, dragonflies in flight, and again trying to do montage plates that showed all of these animals together. So after about a period of, I think, 10 years, you'll notice that there's a suite of images, a suite of books here, and a lot of them have got a P on them, which is the Princeton logo. So Wild Guides very quickly morphed into a Princeton Wild Guides imprint. That gave us the opportunity for much wider circulation of books. But as soon as we started to do this, we realized, of course, there were big gaps. So the big gaps here are going to be birds, because we hadn't done any bird books, and we wanted to do Britain and Europe, and of course realized that in 1999, Collins produced a fantastic field guide that everybody uses, I'm sure. It's illustrated, and it's really great, and it's the book I often turn to for fine detail. But a lot of people said, why don't we just try to do this with birds? And just a little bit before we'd started to think about it, a guy called Rob Hume, a very well-known author, has started producing a book, and in 2014, this Dorling Kindersley book on birds of Britain and Europe was produced. It was okay, as far as I was concerned. It was much better than anything I'd seen before, but it was a little bit difficult to use, I think, I would say. So it was in 2013, the year that we spoke to Rob Hume and said, when you finish that one, why don't we just work together on another one? So we did produce start to think about this book, which was to produce a book that covered every species ever recorded and all the plumages ever recorded in Britain and Ireland. So that was the challenge in 2013. And all, of course, we needed to do to make this book happen was to come up with a definitive list of the species and plumages we wanted to use, find all the photos, get the maps, write the text, identify the status of all the species, and design the book. So quite a simple job, really. This is a really, really difficult job. So the only way to do it was to get a team together, and the team was, Rob Hume did agree to do this book as one of the best sort of writers of bird field guides. So he immediately said, yes, okay, I'd love to do this. Rob's still as the main designer. And there were 3 photographers, myself, Hugh Harrop and David Tippling, were very well-known photographers in the UK, agreed to come in with their images and contribute their images to the project. And I was given the job of project managing everything, make it all happen, just to keep me amused. So the way we went about this was, first of all, come up with a complete list of all the plumages we wanted for the entire book. This is just as an example of what we did. It's basically a spreadsheet. That every line is each image that you need, and then you just basically go through all the images you've got and identify those that would be suitable for your search criteria. So this is the sort of lump of images that was on the screen as a result of doing the first sift with the images that, between us, the 3 photographers had. Every image we looked at we had to assess, and these are blue tits, and we looked at them in relation to a whole range of characteristics. So the pose had to be appropriate, the key features had to be shown, every image had to be fully sharp throughout, it had to be properly exposed, it had to have flat lighting, because you don't want to have hard shadows that give a wrong impression of a bird, and they had to be unobscured, no branches in front of the bird, and ideally without a messy background. So every image we looked at, we had to apply those criteria to every image. So these are 2 images that were the first 2 on this suite of images that were shortlisted initially. That one failed. You might wonder why it's failed. Well, the tail isn't in focus. It's on a slightly dodgy looking blue branch, and it basically wasn't going to work in a field guide. This one, you're looking down too much on the bird and it's got some shadows on the belly. Basically it wasn't going to work. So what I'm trying to do here is to just flag up some of the issues we have in trying to select photos that would be suitable for a field guide like this. I just put a few more photos in just to explain why they would be rejected, because it's actually quite helpful for people if they're thinking, oh, this would be a great photo for a field guide, as to why they might or might not work. So the photo at the top, a nice photo of a blue tit, though it has that horrible little shadow on the back. So unfortunately that one gets a red cross. The one at the bottom, nice photo, but shadowy on the belly, and it's got a messy background, unfortunately gets rejected. And here, 2 more photos, very similar, but if you were to choose one, you definitely would go for the bottom one, I think, because it's got a better pose, and it's not looking down, and it's basically going to get that sort of marking. So we go through every image like this and then decide which of the ones are definitely going to be shortlisted for review. 2 more images here that would definitely pass the test because they're nicely positioned, they have no hard shadows. One at the bottom, okay, it's on a barbed wire fence, so it's not ideal, but it's at least it would be usable if you had to use that in a field guide. And it was here then that we definitely realised we needed more photo, and more photos, and the best source of images that we could come up with, and got to know the guys at Agami Photo Agency in the Netherlands, was that they had a fantastic portfolio of images from many of the best photographers in Europe, some of whom are here today, in fact. So Agami came to the rescue, and as a result of the Agami portfolio, we ended up with 9 images that we could then say, okay, yeah, these are the ones that we could consider to be put in the book. We then fill in our form, make sure that we know the details of every image, green out our sourced column so we know we've got everything. And at the end of the day, you then end up with a sort of red cell here that you know there's one you still need to get before you can complete that plate. And then the next phase is to verify every image to make sure it is what it is. And there's a guy called Chris Batty, who's one of the best British birders, who agreed to come in and look at every photo that we had shortlisted to make sure that it was correctly identified, to make sure that the subspecies shown in that photo was relevant to Britain or Ireland, and that the plumage was one of the plumages shown on our chart, and that the file captioning was accurate. There weren't any abnormalities, rings on the bird or white feathers or whatever. And at the end of the day, we'd assessed 2,500 photos and shortlisted 25,000. That is a lot of work. We then needed to design the book. So having done all that, we then needed to design the book. So the plates ended up looking like this. So having done all that work, we ended up with 3 photos that were positioned on a plate like this. When you're producing a plate like this, you can't just think of it in isolation, because every book obviously has a page spread. So when you open the book, you can see a left page and a right page. And there was no point in producing a page that showed the blue tit bigger than a great tit when we know that the great tit is bigger than a blue tit. So you then had to redesign every plate to make sure that the comparative sizes across the spread actually worked as well. So that's what we ended up with at the end of the day. And it was a lot of work. Filled in the form, made sure there were no red boxes in that sourced column, and away we were ready to go. Book was published in 2016, and it does cover every species and all the plumages ever recorded in Britain and Ireland. That was 619 species, and we used in that book 3,200 photos with contribution for 251 photographers. And the plates themselves look basically like this, so you have a full page of each species and lots of comparative spreads. But that's where it often became tricky because you needed to get images of the birds in the same profile as far as we could. That was actually quite complicated for many of the groups. So that was an interesting experience, and lots of other pages were very similar, but it did involve collating lots of material that allowed you to do, for example, a flow of gulls that showed how some species, like the black-headed gull here at the top, takes 2 years to reach maturity. We then explained my confusion earlier on in my birding career. Some have a black head, some have some brown on the wings, and so on, and that gave me the opportunity to show the different plumages for black-headed gull, and then another gull at the bottom here, which is the herring gull, very similar to the yellow-legged gull here in Spain, has that suite of plumages during a 4-year period. So it's complicated, but this did actually give us an opportunity to do what you would often done with illustrations using photos. So more plates came in a very similar way, and this a whole range of waders and ducks as well. So we managed to produce a whole range of great plates. Lots of people liked the book, and that was really good news. And as a result of that, we just thought, okay, what do we do next? Well, Europe's birds. So it's exactly the same process, covering every species in Europe, and that basically led us to producing Europe's birds, covering this part of the world. So I think I'm just conscious of the time. How are we going, please? Okay, I will. I think just stop there, just to make the point that doing Europe's birds involved covering the Azores and the Canary Islands. We decided to exclude the northern part of northern Africa and the Middle East. So it basically is the whole of Europe up to the Urals, and in total 928 species we needed to cover. So we did exactly the same process as we did with Britain's birds, and the book is now out, and hopefully if you get a chance to look at it, and I'm happy to chat to you about it if you want. I'll be around in the Oryx stand after the presentation, and hopefully that gives an indication as to what we have to do to produce a book like this. Okay, thank you very much.